Welcome to chapter 2 of the book of Jeremiah. Before I jump into chapter 2, I want to cover a couple of things about the book of Jeremiah that we didn't cover last time. We spent a lot of time last time at the beginning talking about the history around what was going on at the time of Jeremiah, what had been transpiring in between the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah, because there's almost 100 years between them. So let's talk about some literary things around the book of Jeremiah. This can give us some good insight into uh, biblical writings overall. So in Thompson's book, the book of Jeremiah, this is one thing that he had to say about the book itself, the book of Jeremiah. He said, "The one thing that does become clear is that the book of Jeremiah, as we have it today, was the result of a long and complex process. It is a collection of collections which were brought together by more than one hand over a period of time. Some of the material was written, as for example, Jeremiah's first and second scrolls. Some of it was orally transmitted for a time. It seems probable that a written tradition and an oral tradition existed side by side, and the two interacted. The oral tradition sifting, shaping, grouping, and supplementing material. The written tradition serving as a control on the vagaries of the oral. The oral tradition, however, grew by the application of exegetical and homiletical principles which sought not merely to preserve the message of Jeremiah, but also to show its continuing applicability as the years went by. During his lifetime and after his death, all these factors have contributed to the making of the book of Jeremiah. The very complexity of the process accounts for the seeming disarray of the book to our modern logic-oriented thinking. Nevertheless, we can go a long way in interpreting and understanding the smaller segments of the book and the Word of God, which Jeremiah brought to the people of Judah in the late 7th and early 6th centuries, can be read and understood against a background which is remarkably well attested." So, what he's talking about here is in the time of Jeremiah, okay, there are some things that we know that were written down. Some things were Jeremiah writing things down. Some things were Jeremiah dictating to Baruch, and Baruch was writing it down. But there's also some things that were talked about that were what we call an oral tradition. What that means is that is something that Jeremiah says or does that gets shared verbally, but doesn't necessarily get written down all the time. So some of that was written down later, and then the writings that they had were brought together with writing down the oral tradition, and then they were kind of compared and pulled together to say, okay, well, this was written down earlier, so this must be more true, and then try to compile the writings of Jeremiah together. So we can think of Jeremiah as during his day, there are writings, there are scrolls of his prophecies that are being written down and copied and shared and distributed among the people who were believers in God, uh, in Judah in that area, basically, as well as some of the other countries and places where he was sending letters to. Those are part of what was there, but then later they incorporate some of the writings and journal entries of Jeremiah into the book of Jeremiah to create the story, the narrative we get in the book of Jeremiah. So again, some of that is writings from Jeremiah, some of that's Baruch, some of it could be oral traditions that were written down later, stories of Jeremiah that people remembered. They wrote them all down and then try to compile it into a bit of a narrative and then combine it all into this one book. So realize the idea that Jeremiah sat down, wrote all this out, compiled it himself, did all this during his lifetime is probably not realistic. That's probably not what happened. So we have to understand that when the Bible came together, it wasn't a Bible. It was lots of pieces of stories and pieces of things here and there that were then brought together to create the books we have today. So in the writing styles in the book of Jeremiah, we can see some of these changes. And so that we'll talk a little bit about them as we go along. One of the special things we get in the book of Jeremiah from a literary standpoint is a thing called a Jeremiad. What this is this is a kind of a lamentation. This is Jeremiah feeling bad, either about himself, feeling bad about what's going to happen to the Jews, or those kinds of things. And it's kind of a unique feature to the book of Jeremiah that we get. We don't see this lamenting quite as much in other books of Scripture. So there's these things, we call them Jeremiads, that we'll find in here as well. We'll try to point a few of them out as we go. But I want to just give you kind of a high-level view of some of the historical concepts of this book, not just what we're learning in the book, but about the book itself. Another one that's important for us to look at is understand that there is a large difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible when it comes to understanding the book of Jeremiah. So when I talk about Hebrew Bible, I'm talking about, you can go look it up, the Hebrew Bible, and get one English translation of a Hebrew Bible or something. The Hebrew Bible is the Bible that's predominantly used in more for ancient Judaism, basically. It's the compilation of like the Torah, which is the books of Moses and things that the Jews, even in Jewish communities today, still use that. The Talmud is kind of the Old Testament for them, and then the Hebrew Bible is kind of a Hebrew translation of all those things pulled together. And it's used and has been commonly used in some of the English translations of the Bible we get today, like the King James Version or the New Revised Standard editions or things like that. The Greek Bible is known as the Septuagint. It got the word Septuagint because it means 70 in Greek, and it took 70 scholars to put it all together. Basically, if I remember right, it's why it's called the Septuagint. It's the Greek translation. Now, it was made. It wasn't necessarily made later. I think the Greek one is actually older than the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that we have today. So there's still copies of copies from the originals. We don't have them in the originals. But the Septuagint is about 1/8 shorter than the Hebrew Bible in the book of Jeremiah. So there are certain there's certain chapters that are a little shorter, and there's a couple chapters that are a lot shorter. In the Greek version, which is the older of the two out of the Hebrew and Greek, the Greek one is the older manuscript, if I remember correctly. And if you're a Bible scholar, feel free to correct me on my facts on this. Please put in the comments what the facts are if I'm misstating things. So here's what's interesting is they used the Hebrew Bible a lot when doing the King James Version. I think Septuagint was an influence in the King James Version as well. But it's the book of Jeremiah follows the Hebrew version, which is not as old as the Septuagint. So we actually get the longer version in the King James Bible because that's what the Masoretic text does more with. It kind of bypasses a lot of the Greek ones and goes with more the Hebrew and other English translations as well, basically. So we get the longer one in the King James Version. So we're going to see as we go through the book of Jeremiah in these videos, we're going to see that longer text. But I'm going to try to talk about some of those differences to give some ideas on what happened with those, basically, just to kind of point those out. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a game changer as far as like, oh, suddenly the book of Jeremiah is not true, because there's two different copies of it. And what do we do? There are some logical things to say, some things were left out of the Septuagint, and it seems like they seem a little redundant. So the Hebrew Bible and the Masoretic text kept them in, which is what we get a lot of the King James Version based on. But the Greek version just said, no, we've already covered that topic. We don't need to do it again, kind of an idea. We don't need to repeat that story. So there's a few discrepancies. So just realize that when you get into understanding the Bible, that it's not a perfect book. There's things that you can point to and say, is that really supposed to be in here? Is that not? Or how did this get pulled together? How did it get influenced by past scribes as they were doing things? So just some interesting facts, some interesting ideas about this book to help us understand the history of the book of Jeremiah better as we continue forward. So now let's jump into chapter 2 and get more into what is talked about in chapter 2. So chapter 2 is a really interesting one. It is, we talked about just a couple minutes ago, this idea of Jeremiads. This is a Jeremiad chapter. This is a big classical one. There's a lot of good stuff we get in here. So this chapter kind of follows a tradition, a common thought, a common way of doing things in the ancient world. So in fact, let's talk about this common idea because we'll see this play out. In the ancient world, there was a common format that was used when a ruler of a higher government wanted to reprove a ruler under them. So if you have like a governor wants to reprove a mayor, or a president wants to reprove a governor, something, if they have like these different levels of government, so a higher government official trying to reprove somebody underneath them. So it says the shape was as follows: one, an appeal to the vassal, to the lower one, to pay heed, and a summons to the earth and the sky to act as witnesses. Two, a series of questions, each of which carried an implied accusation. Three, a recollection of past benefits bestowed on the vassal with some statement of the offenses by which they had broken the treaty or the covenant, whatever it is. And then four, a reference to the futility of ritual compensations, recourse to foreign cults, and other kinds of aid. And then fifth, a declaration of culpability and a threat of judgment. So this is kind of a common, we see there's an ancient world, there's letters where a king is writing a letter to a lower ruler underneath, they usually have like a major king, but then there's like governors over different parts of the kingdom. So if the king wants to approve a governor, he's going to follow this pattern. We have letters of antiquity that show this pattern was commonly used, basically. And now this pattern is discernible in chapter 2 as well. Although it has been transformed and partly obscured by the present literary form, we shall propose that the chapter consists of a literary arrangement of several originally independent segments brought together to serve a theological purpose. That was Thompson in his book of Jeremiah. So it's interesting that we'll see this pattern play out. We're going to learn in this chapter, God is trying to reprove Judah. So a higher level reproving a lower level. But God put this together through this revelation in a pattern that fits with the culture of the time. So God is reproving them in a way that they would understand. So he's delivering his message in a way that it makes sense to the people, basically, which is a really cool thing to think about. But it was somewhat like we talked about earlier, as there were translations and compilations of pulling things together to make the book of Jeremiah. This was put in a literary form that kind of changed it's not as clear as it probably was originally to see that pattern inside this chapter, basically. So we're going to get into this more now. So let's start with verse 1. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. So this is really interesting to think of an espousal. So this is God telling Israel, I remember when we were courting, basically, kind of a courtship before marriage, when we were dating and kind of hanging out, basically. So it's important to look at the marriage is not just a legal contract, but desire to understand each other. Very personal and willing to work together. So this is, again, two people who are falling in love and are willing to work together with each other. That's what a marriage really is you should be willing to work together on things. More than the rule should be working together. The exception should be relying on outside sources instead of each other. Now, the ordinances and rituals Israel were asked to follow were all about helping them remember their God and how he has helped them in times of need, as well as the covenant between them. So here's what's interesting in this verse, okay? We see it start off with this idea of two people in a courtship. They're kind of dating, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals. When thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. So we can see this idea of it's an area that has not been planted and harvested and has been worked over, but a new land, a raw, natural land. And they're no longer working together, but this is God reminding them, hey, I remember the good old days before we had the problems we do, when life was simple and easy and we just kind of loved each other, basically. In fact, verse 3, he continues on here and he says, Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase. All that devour him shall offend. Evil shall come upon them, saith the Lord. So Israel used to take their first crop and harvest and dedicate it to God. This was part of the law of Moses. So the first fruits of his increase is really interesting, that Israel, the people that are followers of God, are the harvest of God. So if you think of the idea of God wants us to become his children, then anybody who converts to him is harvest. He's nurturing and growing and getting into that harvest idea. Now they were eating the sacred devotion instead of giving it to God when this is the problem that they had, basically. So we can see this even in verse 2 with the idea of going into the wilderness, because they used to go into the wilderness to pray to God. But then Israel changed. And that's what God is getting at here with this kind of a looking backwards love letter to Israel, to Jerusalem and Judah, is to say, I remember when you used to look for me, but now you look for false gods. I remember when you were the best thing of God, basically. But Israel was holiness to the Lord. But you changed. You changed the ordinances. You've gone away from God, basically. So it's interesting that they went from offering their first fruits to God to eating the first fruits for themselves. They gave it to themselves instead of offered that to God. In some Akkadian texts, the word eat sometimes represented an unauthorized invasion. So you can kind of see that idea of consumption, their unauthorized consumption of what should be God's, basically. Now, with this as well, verse 4, hear ye the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. So this is God putting that plea up front. I remember the good old days when it was better than this, but it's not now. Hear my message. Here's what I want to tell you. So that was kind of step 1, and now we're getting into that step 2 idea from those 5 steps of the letters that the higher king would write to a lower king. Verse 5, thus saith the Lord, what iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain. So this is really an interesting phrase, because this is God saying, what have I done to offend you? What sin have I committed that would cause you to leave me, basically? So kind of the idea of, it's like we're serving him the divorce papers, even though he has never signed them or agreed to it. So that he's going, what did I do? I didn't do anything wrong. Tell me what was my problem? What did I do to drive you away from me? And that really is an interesting, almost rhetorical question coming from God, because God's not the one that did anything wrong. It was Israel. It was Judah. The people went away from God. God didn't go away from the people. So verse 6, it says here, neither said they, where is the Lord that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and of the shadow of death, through a land that no man passed through and where no man dwelt. So God's saying, you never said anything about this. You're not saying, oh, where's this God that did these great miracles in the past? They're not asking for God. They're not looking for God. They're looking for a way to do what they want, and someone who will make them feel okay about doing what they want. And God's not going to do that. God's going to say, here's the standard, you need to follow it. Now, verse 7, and I brought you into a plentiful country, to eat the fruit thereof and the goodness thereof. But when ye entered, ye defiled my land, and made mine heritage an abomination. So again, this is God saying, you're not even asking for me. You're not wanting to know, how can I help you? I even brought you to a great country. I brought you to a land where you have the opportunities to thrive. And yet, you still won't follow me. You won't listen to me, basically. You have altered what I have put together. You've taken what I gave you as a blessing, and you turned it into a problem. So verse 8, continuing on with this, the priests said not. So this is God saying, even your priests, who should be pointing you to me, aren't doing their job, basically. He said, the priest said not, where is the Lord? And they that handle the law knew me not. The pastors also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after things that do not profit. So even the religious leaders, they're the ones that should be pointing the people to God. They're the ones that should be helping people come to God and go, no, no, guys, hold on, don't go that way. You're going the wrong direction. Let's get a course correction in here and help you to go on the right path. Even the religious leaders are not stopping this digression of the people. In fact, they're probably part of the contributors of that digression away from God. So, in fact, Jared Halverson had this to say, which is interesting, is the prophets prophesied by Baal. He says, this is idolatry, but used as a metaphor of adultery. Remember, we've talked about this in the past. The concept of idolatry and the concept of adultery is kind of the same. Sometimes they use that word interchangeably in the ancient writings. So idolatry is spiritual adultery, basically. And this is how God sees this in the Old Testament. So those two words are quite similar. So when their prophets are prophesying by Baal, they're giving prophecy not by God, but worshiping a different God and trying to get information from that God. So Isaiah taught the marriage metaphor as a good thing of coming together, but Jeremiah is all about the separation and failed marriage. Jeremiah is trying to be a counselor to them in a way. So this is a really great way to think about Jeremiah. If you remember from Isaiah, and hopefully you've watched those videos. If not, go watch them. Spectacular things we learn in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah spent a lot of his time on this idea of a marriage as a metaphor for our relationship with God. We should think about our connection with Jesus Christ as a marriage. We're the bride, he's the groom. We should get married to him. What does that mean? What does that imply? If we are the bride and he's the groom, what does that mean about the covenants and promises we make to each other? Isaiah spends a lot of time on that, and it's a wonderful metaphor. Absolutely wonderful metaphor for us to understand the gospel better. I love that it's teaching us the gospel from a woman's perspective. So guys, if you want to understand the gospel better, you need to understand it from a woman's perspective, which means working nicely with women to help them teach you and understand what does that mean. Because there's a lot of deep doctrines that are hidden within a woman's perspective. And Isaiah is a great example of that. But anyways, that's my little soapbox for a second there. So here's the thing to think about, okay? Isaiah again, talking about the marriage covenant. Hey, we need to get married. We need to get together, but you're breaking my covenant. And so now we're at the time of Jeremiah, nearly 100 years later, and Jeremiah's going, you guys have broken the covenant. You guys have gone away from God. We need to solve this. Jeremiah is trying to bring the marriage back, bring that connection back. And God wants that connection back, but the people don't. And that's the problem. So if you think of that marriage metaphor from Isaiah, you'll see a lot of other metaphor and symbolism in the writings of Jeremiah, basically, which is going to be really good. Now in here, in verse 8, there's the part that's in italicized at the end. It says, and walked after things that do not profit. Now the Hebrew basically says they do not profit. Now this is interesting. It's a play on the name of Baal, basically, because Baal was known as, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase of it. If you're a Hebrew scholar and know that, please put it in the comments. But one of the meanings of the word Baal is, a profitable god. He was a fertility god, basically, as well as a storm deity. And so he was about bringing new life, bringing abundance. You had little, he's bringing abundance to you. And so this is kind of interesting that in here, God is saying they're following a God that's not actually really helping them. Even though that's kind of what the worship of Baal was all about, was getting help, getting divine help to better my life without having me to change my life, basically. That's kind of like the weight loss pill. I want to lose weight, but I don't want to have to eat right and exercise. That's what Baal was back then, basically, which is why he was so popular for the people. But God's saying he's nothing. There's no profit in this, but they think there is, but there isn't. It's so crazy. So it's a kind of fun play on words when you look at the Hebrew on verse 8. Now verse 9, wherefore, oh, let me point out something real quick for you here. If you notice in verse 9, there's that little P, kind of a backwards P symbol that's in there. Many of you have probably wondered, what does that mean? They're all over in the Bible. What does that little carriage return, or paragraph symbol mean? That was put in like centuries ago as they're doing the translations of the scriptures to mark where in some of the more original documents there was the end of a story or information in the beginning of a next one. So this was not so much ancient chapters, when they broke it down in chapters, but you could see it that way. But there was, here was a story, and then here's the end of it, and then here's the beginning of the next one. That symbol means there's one story and here's the next story, kind of an idea. So that's a way to look at that, to understand the scriptures better. Now, but in verse 9 it says, wherefore I will let yet plead with you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children will I plead. Now another translation that comes in here is different on this word plead. So if we look at this, the way it's translated right now in the King James Version, I will plead with you, meaning God is going to keep trying to get us to come back to him, basically, which is good. Another way that this verse is translated is, instead of the word plead, meaning the God begging us to come to him, is bring a charge against you. So if we look at it from that standpoint, wherefore I will bring a charge against you, saith the Lord, with your children's children will I charge them. So that changes the meaning of this, realizing this is not as much mercy, but possibly judgment as well. Those can kind of flip-flop between each other in those words. So this doesn't look good for Israel, is the main message, basically. They had a chance to repent. They've had lots of time to repent, and they're not repenting. They're not doing what they should be doing. And that's why they're about to have the problems they're about to have. Now verse 10, it says, for pass over the isles of Chittim, and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing. So this is, go find the proof. Go find, I'm telling the truth. This is real. So verse 11, continuing on, hath a nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. So that's kind of the same idea again. Now, if we look at this, Thompson in his book of Jeremiah said this. He said, no nation had ever changed its ancient gods, even if its gods were not real gods. Whether one traveled to the western isles, the isles or shores of Kittim, or the Arab tribes of the desert away to the east, such a phenomenon would never be observed. There was a certain literalness in this claim. While over the centuries, polytheists, those are people who believe in multiple gods, changed the names of their deities or their relative importance within the pantheon due to synchronistic contacts with their neighbors, or due to the infiltration of foreigners, the changes were not fundamental, since their deities were personifications of aspects of nature and remained basically the same. But Yahweh stood outside of the whole universe, and to bring him down to the level of a nature deity and attempt to subordinate him to the laws and limitations of nature was to make him a radically different deity, however much his names and titles were retained. So when you think about this idea, in the ancient world, they had a lot of different gods. Polytheism was very common, many gods. Even dating to back in the time of Abraham, we can see that. So there were gods over certain lands. When you moved to that land, you worshipped the god of that land, because if you didn't, you'd have a horrible time in that land. So if you moved to Egypt, you worship the god of Egypt. If you moved to Israel, you worship the god of Israel. And we've seen this in past stories of kings who've come down and have realized that Israel's God is a good God, and so they don't want to live there. There's a story, oh man, who was it? I can't remember the name right now. If you can think of it, put it in the comments. There was a king, who realized that Israel had the real God, and so he actually asked for several yards of dirt to be scooped up and brought to his palace, his land, and laid down to where he could have Israelite soil so that he could worship the God of Israel. He didn't move to Israel. He brought a piece of Israel to him so that he could then worship the God of the land. So he took it in a literal sense, basically. So there was God of the land, and then there was gods of nature. There was the storm god deity. There's Asherah, the fertility goddess. There were gods of water and gods of clouds and gods of lightning and thunder and heat, gods of the sun, gods of the moon. There's lots of different gods you had. And then they would be over certain phenomenon of nature. So depending upon which thing you needed help, you would give obeisance to that god. If you needed rain, you'd give it to the storm gods to bring in a storm. Those kinds of things. So this was the idea. But what Israel did is they had the God. They had the real God, Yahweh or Jehovah. And he was the God that created everything. There wasn't all these little gods that were out there. He was the God for all of it. But yet Israel started to change culturally their religion. They let culture affect their religion. And culturally they changed to interpret things differently. And so then that's how they ended up doing Canaanite religion, basically, rather than Israelite religion. And so that was the problem that is brought up in verse 11 is nobody changes their gods. They might change the name of their god. Sometimes we'll have gods of El or Elohim for gods plural. Sometimes, but then there's Marduk, then there's Bel, and there's all these other ones. Sometimes the name of the gods would change based upon where you were and what time frame, but that was a god was still the same. But Israel, who they've been told Jehovah is the God of Israel, the God of the people and God of the land, they didn't follow him. They changed him and tried to bring him down to an equal level as an idol. And he's like, that's not me. I'm not here to take care of you. I'm not here to worship you. You're here to worship me and ask for me for help, and I'll help you. So they tried to make the real God similar to the fake gods, basically. And again, there's that play at the end of verse 11, that which doth not profit, play in the name of Bel. So Bel means owner or lord. So this can be translated as Lord useless. So God is calling Bel Lord useless. That's his nickname from God, basically. You are Lord useless, basically. And so he's whereas it should mean abundance, benefits, opportunities, God's going, no, that's not him. So that's the nickname God gave Bel, Lord useless, basically. Verse 12, let's continue on here. Be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, say the Lord. Now, if you remember, we talked about at the beginning, there's those 5 things of these letters that the kings would write to a lesser king. I think this is number 3, where he's asking the natural elements to be a witness to what is going on. Just like he said in verse 4, O ye heavens, be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, saith the Lord. So let's get things going. In fact, verse 13, he brings water into this as well, another natural element. For my people have committed 2 evils. They have, 1, forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and 2, they have hewed out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So let's look at this metaphor for a second here. God sees himself as the fountain of living water, a resource for us to consume, us to use, to benefit us and bless our lives. But the problem is they ignored it. So that is a sin of omission. They should have enjoyed the living waters, but they didn't. Then there's the sin of commission, which is what they did that they shouldn't have. And what was that? They tried to dig their own well. They tried to get water their way rather than God's way. So they were trying to figure out, how do I get my cake and eat it too? How can I have the blessings of God but not have to change the way God wants me to change? So God provides real water for us, unlimited water. Israel decided to dig their own pit to hold their own water, but it was broken, so it leaked. Israel preferred their own problems rather than God's solution. Now, how often does this happen in life? How often do we feel like we are smarter than God? We can do it. We don't need God's help. And we just learn to tolerate the problems that come in life. There's no need for those problems. Look at something like fraud. Should we be having fraud? Should credit card fraud be a thing? Should dishonesty in business be a thing? No, it shouldn't. But because we're not willing to follow the principles of God, of being honest and having integrity in what we do, we are living with the problems of not following God, the problems coming from dishonesty. If we followed God, most of those problems would go away and life would be better. The economy would be better. We'd all have more money. We'd all be in a much more stable economic structure. But that means we have to change. We would rather let the world fall apart and live terrible ways so that we don't have to change our inside. We don't have to change ourselves. That is the problem in the world. That is what's so popular. We need to be willing to change ourselves before we worry about changing the rest of the world. Conversion yourself. Get yourself warned, then warn your neighbor, kind of an idea. Now, interesting on this, Old Testament Study Manual said in verse 13, the two evils committed by Judah are told in figurative terms. They have forsaken the fountain of which is Jehovah of living water, and they have hewn out broken cisterns, which are false gods, which can hold no water. Basically, they're fake. They're baloney. They're not even alive. They're just an inanimate object. Then the image is changed, and the Lord states that Israel had partaken of the waters of Sihor, which is the Nile, and of the river, which is the Euphrates River. So in other words, they drank the spiritual waters of Egypt and Babylon and were filled with the lifeless water of idolatry. So we're going to see that as we go down several more verses. We're going to see this play out. So verse 14, is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? So this is talking about the status of Israel. Is Israel a servant? Are they a homeborn slave? What's going on? Why are they spoiled? Why do they have some of the benefits or challenges they have? So verse 15, we're going to see a little bit of a metaphor here. The young lions roared upon him and yelled, and they made his land waste. His cities are burned without inhabitant. Thompson said, if then the Assyrians are represented by the roaring lions of verse 15, the devastation of the land and the destruction of the cities and their subsequent abandonment may refer to any one of a number of Assyrian campaigns from the days of Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, or Sargon II, even Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, each of whom had campaigns which touched on the territory of Israel at some point. So if we think of young lions, because Babylon hasn't marched in and destroyed things at this point in Jeremiah's timeline. So the young lions could be seen as Assyria, who came through over 100 years ago, prior to Jeremiah, and destroyed Israel and laid waste to the cities. And you can tell there's a lot of Assyrian kings that were involved in fighting Israel and conquering them. So in fact, verse 16, and also the children of Noph and Tahpanhes have broken the crown of thy head. Now Tahpanhes is in Egypt. It's the land of Goshen. If that sounds familiar, that's the land of the place where Moses' family was from, in Egypt, the land of Goshen. So Noph and Tahpanhes were two cities of Egypt, otherwise called Memphis and Daphne. Those are good to know. Memphis and Daphne. You can look those ones up on a map usually and see those more than you can Goshen. It is well known that the good king was defeated by the Egyptians and slain in battle. Thus was the crown of Judah's head broken. This is from Adam Clarke in his commentary on Jeremiah. So realize that that's what he's talking about here. Egypt has broken the crown. Egypt and Israel fought. Israel lost. I believe that was against Josiah. Josiah died in battle, and so Josiah's son was brought in to be the king, which was no, Hezekiah died and then brought in Manasseh. It was Josiah after that, excuse me. So Egypt caused a transition in the kingdom of Israel, and which caused a lot of problems. Now let's look at this. Noph is Memphis, the ancient capital of Lower Egypt. This is located 13 miles south of the modern Cairo. So if you think of where Cairo is today, 13 miles south was the capital of the southern kingdom. Egypt used to be a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom in the very ancient world, and then they eventually joined into one. Memphis was an ancient capital of the southern kingdom. So it was south of Cairo. Taphanes is the later Greek Daphne, represented today by Tel Defne, situated near Lake Manzala in northeastern Egypt. Now, there is some ambiguity about verse 16. The fact that Noph and Tahpanhes were mentioned and not Egypt as such may suggest that at the time the poem was written, Egypt was a vassal of Assyria, and these two towns would then represent places which were severely mauled by the Assyrians in the campaigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. Those were Esarhaddon came through 681 to 669 when he reigned, and Ashurbanipal was 669 to 627. Remember, around 627 was the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry. In that case, the verse might be translated, "The men of Noph and Taphanes will crack your skulls." It is a prophecy that these places will yet rise to deal a blow against Judah from the south. However, it is arguable that whatever the original form of the poem may have been, Jeremiah has drawn into an enlarged version of the original, a reference to the campaign of Pharaoh Necho in 609 BC, as he passed through the land on his way to bring help to the Assyrians. So that's when Josiah dies, if I remember right, when that happens. So Israel is playing a part in this, or Egypt is playing a part in Israel's history, basically, with that one. Now, verse 17. Hast thou not procured this unto thyself, in that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way? Now, Israel had no problems dealing with their neighbors, but they had a huge problem because they ignored God. Israel thought they were pretty good about defending against their enemies around them, but they went away from God. Say, thou hast not procured this unto thyself, and that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way. So God's trying to lead them and help them, but they're rejecting what he wants them to do, basically. Now, verse 18, and now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt? To drink the waters of Sihor? Remember we talked about that, that's the Nile. Or what hast thou to do in the way of Assyria? To drink the waters of the river? That would be the Euphrates River that came through there. So in verse 18, Jeremiah makes use here of a theme used by other prophets, namely, that it is futile for Judah to rely upon Egypt or Assyria or any other nation. So drinking the waters of these rivers is symbol of Israel, or Judah basically I should say, trying to seek help, seek sustenance from these other countries against Babylon, which is the new invading superpower that's coming in. And it's not going to work out for them, basically. They're not going to get the life, they're not going to get the sustenance they need from Assyria and Egypt, basically. And that's going to be a big problem for Israel. Verse 19 now, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backslidings shall reprove thee. That's an important point, okay? God tried to help you change when you could change. And now you have to face the consequence of your own sin, which is worse. Because it says here, now therefore, and see that it is an evil thing and bitter, that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord God of hosts. So he's going, you're doing this to yourself. Because you've forsaken me, the law says you have to be punished in this way. And if you're not repenting and apologizing, then it's going to happen, basically. Also, the Old Testament Study Manual had this to say on verse 19. It says, verse 19 teaches the important truth that one is punished by as well as for one's transgressions. The phrase, my fear is not in thee, refers to the fear of God. Fear in the Hebrew denotes a sense of reverent awe and profound respect. So it's not that we fear God, but we respect him. We've talked about that a few times in the past. If the Jews had this fear in them, they would not need to learn through the consequences of their transgressions. So if they had greatly respected God and wanted to follow him, they would realize that they needed to repent. They don't need to go through the sufferings they're about to go through, basically. So really interesting to look at this. And I like this concept at the beginning of verse 19, thine own wickedness shall correct thee. Now, I don't know about you, but if you look back in your life and you see where you've caused sin to happen in your life, you have sinned, you've had challenges. If you notice, there are natural consequences to those. And sometimes those natural consequences end up causing us to be wishing we hadn't done it in the first place. This is kind of that natural consequence. So in a way, your sin is correcting you. Basically, you're going, oh, I didn't anticipate that effect from this sin. Now I wish I hadn't done it. Oh, I shouldn't have gotten involved in drugs because now my life is ruined and horrible. If I would have just listened and not gotten involved with drugs, I wouldn't be where I'm at. So in a way, the sin kind of reproves you and in a way becomes an encouragement to change and come back. It's just better not to go down that road, but if you do, it kind of triggers itself to encourage you to come back, which is really interesting to think about. So verse 20, for of old time I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bands. Remember, this is God reminding Israel, I have bailed you out in the past. Okay, he says, and thou saidest, I will not transgress. So this is God letting them go from their sins and transgressions. And they're going, yes, I promise, if you get me out of this, God, I will do what you want me to do. I'll keep your commandments. It's going to be great. And then he says, when upon every high hill and under every green tree thou wanderest, playing the harlot. So again, God saved them. They pleaded, help bail us out. If you bail us out, God, we'll do whatever you want. What happened when he bailed them out? They went right back into sin. They didn't do what he wanted, basically. So what's interesting in verse 20 is there's another way to translate this. It can be translated as, you broke your yoke and you said, I will not serve you. This verse might mean God freeing the people from Egypt and they promised to obey him, but it can also mean God letting the people go since they want to break the covenant and do their own thing. So depending upon how you translate the words in verse 20, you can see this from the standpoint of God has helped you and you broke your promise to him. As well as you can see that this verse can be talking about you wanting to be free from the covenant of God. You want to divorce. You want to break off the marriage. And God going, okay, fine. Here's the natural consequence of your choice, basically. And it's interesting, it talks about upon every high hill and under every green tree thou wanderest. So the temple is on a hill. It's usually up in a higher elevation. And so they cheated on the temple with idols. They put idols in the temple. There's no idol for God because he doesn't want us to worship a symbol of him. He wants us to worship him. Personal relationship. He's real. Now, Baal and Asherah were worshipped on the hills and in the forest. They had the idols, up top, they had idols in places. They had altars up on the high hills for fertility rites. They had them in the groves of the trees for fertility rites. So they worshipped the false gods in these places where they should have been worshiping the real God. So it's interesting that they were playing the harlot. Again, I think we can see this in two ways. One is Israel was very promiscuous sexually. That's the fertility rites of Asherah. We've mentioned this, I think in Isaiah we talk about this, how Asherah as a fertility goddess was seen as, if you appeased her with a sacrifice, she would give you what you're asking for. And so what the priest and priestess would do is basically have sex on the altar out in the open where the goddess could see it, so that the act of sex was telling the goddess, here's what we want you to do. We need new life. we're going to get them pregnant. We're going to, we're going to do these things to say, we need you to create new life. We need help. We need crops to grow. We need more food, those kinds of things. But this can also talk about the idea of spiritually stepping away from God. They're worshiping other gods and not the God. Remember, idolatry and adultery is pretty close to the same word when you get into the Hebrew. So playing the harlot is talking about idolatry, but also the rites that were used for Baal and Asherah worship. So hopefully this gets a good picture in your mind that Israel hasn't changed from Isaiah's time. They're still suffering the same sins, the same problems, and they're about to find the consequence of that. You'd hope they would have learned the lesson after Assyria came down and took the northern kingdom away, but they haven't. They almost, in a way, doubled down on those things, and now they're going to run into their own problems because Judah was spared during the Assyrian conquests. That's not going to be the case now with Babylon. So verse 21, yet I had planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. How then art thou turned into the degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me? So here's another great metaphor that God is putting forward for the people to understand that an idea of a noble vine. I have put a king in place that was a righteous king. I have put things in place to help you. The vine will grow and produce fruit. I am producing fruit for you. I have put things in place to bless your life and to help you. And yet you wander off and to go after strange people, other people's vines, not mine. Why are you ignoring me when I'm trying to help you? That's what I want to do. In fact, Thompson, in his book of Jeremiah, said this: the sorek vine provided a second picture for Jeremiah. This vine was a high-quality red grape grown in the Wadi al-Sarar between Jerusalem and the sea. God has planted his people a thoroughly reliable stock, hoping to gather a rich harvest of choice grapes. But she became a strange wild vine, a foul-smelling thing. So this isn't just talking about them being idolatrous and going away from God. This is saying, I tried to bless you and help you, and you have gone astray. You've become a bad vine. And now, well, I have to cut you out. I have to get rid of you before you ruin the rest of the land. So that's interesting that we see that. In fact, verse 22, it says, For though thou wash thee with niter, and take thee much soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord. So as much as you try to cleanse yourself, and this is interesting, washing with niter and take thee much soap, that's lye, you lye in animal fat, you can make soap. Here's what's fascinating. These are symbols of purification. These were common things to use for ritual purification back then. And what God is saying in verse 22 is, even if you do the best ritual purification rites, it is still not enough to eliminate the blood on your hands, the sins that you have committed. You cannot absolve yourself of your own sins. You cannot escape needing God to help with these things, basically. So verse 23 says in here, how canst thou say, I am not polluted? I have not gone after Baalim. See thy way in the valley. Know what thou hast done. Thou art a swift dromedary traversing her ways. So this is really interesting because this is God saying, you can't come to me and say, I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't gone after Baalim. I haven't done anything like that. He's going, look over in the valley. Look at the idols. Look at the altars. Look at what you're doing. I didn't tell you to do any of that, but you are doing it. You are guilty of idolatry, basically. Now, when it talks about see thy way in the valley, a lot of scholars believe that this valley that's mentioned is what's called the Hinnom Valley. This is actually where children were sacrificed to the god Molech. They'd build the two fires. The kids would pass in between them. If the kids didn't die, then they were blessed of Moloch. If they died, Moloch took them back. So that's a lot of people think that's what they're looking at when they look in the valley, is these kinds of idolatrous rites. And then it's interesting at the end here, it says, thou art a swift dromedary. And a dromedary is like a camel, basically a pack animal, traversing her ways. So this has got a really great quote that Thompson put in his book. He says, the imagery indicates that as a camel or a wild ass in heat runs back and forth during the mating season, so did Israel run after false gods. Traversing her ways is a camel in heat running around going, I need a partner, I need a partner, I need to find a partner. So young female camels are altogether unreliable, ungainly, and easily disturbed, so that they dash about in an apparent disorganized fashion. The expression interlacing her tracks or crisscrossing her tracks, that's other ways of thinking about this idea of traversing her ways, is an accurate description of a young camel. Jeremiah had before him a perfect illustration of the fickleness and unreliability of Israel. The female camel in heat is very mild and gives little evidence of the fact. By contrast, the female ass in heat is almost violent. She sniffs the path in front of her, trying to pick up the scent of a male from his urine. Then she races down the road in search of the male. One Arab proverb runs, quote, she is intoxicated with the urine of the male. Under such circumstances, the males need not weary themselves chasing the she-ass because she is bent on chasing them. The description of Israel as a wild ass is thus an extremely vivid description of Israel's lusting after the Baals. Baalim is plural for Baal, so multiple gods or versions of Baal. The two pictures then combine to describe Israel as unreliable in the extreme and captivated, enslaved, and driven on by a fierce passion to seek the gods of Canaan. She is like a young female camel that cannot walk straight, and also like the female wild ass that cannot be diverted from racing straight to her sexual goal. Neither is responsible or reliable. So this is painting a heck of a negative picture. In fact, we're going to get in verse 24, he talks about the wild ass in there, but this is a bad picture for Israel, or for Judah, I should say. I keep saying Israel because I kind of refer to the whole group, but it's mainly Judah. They are so wanting to worship what everybody else is worshiping and ignore the real God, basically. There's a big problem here. So verse 24, a wild ass used to the wilderness, that snuffeth up the wind at her pleasure. In her occasion, who can turn her away? All they that seek her will not weary themselves. In her month they shall find her. So that's that idea of the wild ass, a female donkey basically, who's in heat, at a point where it's easy for them to get pregnant. They're now almost violently hunting a male to help get them pregnant, basically. They're searching the men out, going, I need a man, I need a partner now. Let's get this going now. Now, Joseph Smith translation actually changes the end of verse 24. Instead of, in her month they shall find her, in her month shall not find her. That they won't find her, basically. So this is really an interesting, again, this idea, not good for Judah. They're being portrayed in a bad light. They're being portrayed as not doing what God wants them to do. So verse 24, another thought about this is, you aren't willing to bear the burdens the Lord wants to place on you. So if you think about the idea of a dromedary and a wild ass, these again are pack animals. You keep them around so that you can load your burdens on them and they can carry your burdens for you. But the problem is they don't want to. You can't put your burdens on a wild ass that's in heat because you'll lose everything. It'll fall off. They don't want that. So this is a good other way to think about this metaphor of, are we willing to bear others' burdens? Or are we trying to seek our own lusts and aggrandizement instead of helping others? So there's kind of a fun way to think about that metaphor in there as well. And now verse 25, withhold thy foot from being unshod, and thy throat from thirst. But thou saidst, there is no hope. No, for I have loved strangers, and after them will I go. Now this is really interesting. So in their anxiety to follow after the peoples of the world and worship the false gods, they ran out of the house barefoot and would not even stop to slake their thirst. So they're running, just like we talked about the camel and the donkey seeking lovers, that Judah has left without even putting their shoes on. They left so fast. And they're not even stopping to get a drink before they leave, because you never know when you're going to get your next drink of water. So that's why they had water at home, so you could drink that and quench your thirst and then go out on your journey. They're leaving so fast, they're not even worrying about their own personal care. They're so focused on being with that other lover, the other gods, basically. Now, Thompson said this also about this. He said, evidently Israel was ready to acknowledge the correctness of Jeremiah's analysis of her state, but, like the alcoholic or drug addict, declared that she was incurable. It's no use. No, for I love strange gods. I must go after them. That you can see that in verse 25, where they're going, well, I know I've done wrong. I know I've done bad, but I can't help it. I've got to go do this. It's just how I am. And he goes on and says, in fact, in a strange literal way, Judah eventually suffered the judgment spoken of by Jeremiah and went off shoeless and thirsty into captivity to Babylon. There's a really interesting metaphor, symbolism in that result. It was only when a remnant of these people returned from exile by the miracle of a second Exodus that the infatuation with the fertility cult was finally rooted out. And we're going to see that a lot. This is something that's really interesting, kind of a forward-thinking thought, is when we get into seeing what happened in this exile, it turned into a good thing for Israel. It really did. It wasn't good to go through, but it turned good because it broke their ideas, it broke their culture, broke their thoughts around worshiping the Canaanite gods. And when they came back to Jerusalem, they wanted to do more of their own religion. In fact, getting them out into Babylon forced them to say, oh my gosh, this is not us. Why can't we do what we've always done, which is worship the real God? So it was kind of like in a way, going into exile into Babylon for 70 years was kind of a spiritual detox for Judah, basically. They were able to come back and focus more on worshiping God afterwards, which is great. So it turned into a good thing for them in the long run, basically. Okay, so now let's jump to 26. As the thief is ashamed when he is found, so is the house of Israel ashamed. They, their kings, their princes, and their priests, and their prophets. So everybody's ashamed. The government's ashamed. The religious leaders are ashamed. They're all ashamed that they've been found out, basically. 27, saying to a stock, or which is wood, like an idol, thou art my father, and to a stone thou hast brought me forth. For they have turned their back unto me, and not their face. But in the time of the trouble they will say, arise and save us. Now this is interesting. So this is again talking about idolatry, worshiping false gods. But they're calling the God, you are my father. You are the creator of me. Isn't that interesting? A piece of wood that was carved by a human is claimed to have created humans. That sounds really strange. That's kind of some strange logic. Or even a stone. A craftsman carved a stone to look like a person, a figure, a face or something, and we believe that stone somehow caused us to be created. Who created who? It seems like a circular logic problem in there. So Jeremiah proceeds to make a mocking reference to the practices of Canaanite worship. The people say to a tree, probably the Asherah or wooden pole representing the female Canaanite deity, you are my father, and to a stone, probably the Maseba or standing stone pillar representing the male Canaanite deity, it was you who gave me birth. These stone pillars have been found in excavations in Palestine. From Palestine in 15 BC. All that remains of the wooden poles is a post hole in which the rotted timber has left a differently colored soil. There is enough archaeological evidence for these to indicate a widespread usage. There is strong satire here, For it is the female symbol that is called father, and the male symbol that is called you who gave me birth. So they're giving female attributes to male gods, or vice versa. The female goddess is being called, having male being called a father, basically. So role reversals, changes in those opinions. Israel was confused about what she was worshiping and when she ascribed to the gods of fertility her very existence. Even if such symbols, borrowed as they were from Canaanites, were regarded by some as harmless expressions of an essential truth, they could and did become objects of trust and worship, and were therefore to be rejected. So they took their beliefs way too far in idol worship, and it turned into a bad thing for them, basically. Now, Hugh Nibley had a comment on this too. He said, there is the famous story of the eloquent peasant from the Middle Kingdom in Egypt that tells how the rascally manager of an estate, when he saw a peasant passing by on his way to the market with a load of goods, cried out, "Would that I had some idol that would permit me to rob this man's goods." A dumb image would offer no opposition to any course he chose to take. This was the beauty of idols. They are as impersonal and amoral as money in the bank, the present day as well as the ancient equivalent of a useful idol. So this is the interesting analogy that Hugh Nibley makes in here, thinking that, oh, I just need to make an idol that would justify me committing the crimes I want to commit. If an idol tells me to do it, it's God telling me to do it. Therefore, it's not a crime. So I can now justify getting away with whatever I want. This goes back to that idea we've talked about before. Israel wants to they want to believe they can get to heaven without following the changes that God requires us to make. This happens a lot in our day and age too. A lot of people believe, oh, I don't need to change myself. God will change me. I just accept God and there's nothing I have to do about it, basically. That could be seen as some analogous here. Now, Hugh Nibley in his article talks about money as if it's an idol. And I think there's some value to that. Is we watch movies like the Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge and others where money becomes so important that it's more important than human life. And so lots of greed and things. What you focus on the most is what you love the most, or your idol. So that's what this is talking about, basically. Now, verse 28, continuing on with this, it says, "But where are thy gods that thou hast made thee? Let them arise, if they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah." So he's saying, hey, look, if you want to worship your gods, that's your choice. But don't come crying to me if times are tough and your gods don't help you. Because they're fake gods. They're not going to help you. Just be aware of that, basically. So in fact, this is it's interesting because if you go back to Abraham's life, this is the argument he had. Hey, this God fell over. Okay, well, if you're really a God, if you can control storms and create amazing things, and if you're this great creator, pick yourself up off the ground. You come back the next morning, still down on the ground. Oh, well, you didn't pick yourself up. Why does a human man have to do something you can't do for yourself if you're a God? So Abraham had a lot of these ideas that helped him to realize that idol worship is terrible. It's baloney. It's all fake, basically. So let's continue on with verse 28. Now, something that's interesting here in verse 28, this is like we talked about at the beginning. There's some differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, basically. So the Septuagint adds another phrase at this point of verse 28. They say, "And as many as is the number of Jerusalem's streets, so many are the altars of Bel." So not just according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, but how many streets, you count up all the streets in Jerusalem, that's how many idols and how many altars have been built to worship Baal, the false god. So these additional words are certainly in the spirit of the passage and bring the oracle into the context of Jerusalem. When men worship the powers of nature, they vary in their interpretation of these powers, although they acknowledge the one underlying power. A unitary and coherent picture of deity, such as is taught in Israel's faith, was lacking in natural religions, where the deity was interpreted differently at each local sanctuary. Jeremiah seems to be mockingly calling each local concept of the deity a separate deity. So they worship Baal for certain things in different locations. And he's like, you basically have a bunch of different gods that all have the same name, basically. And they're all fake and they don't work. You need to worship the true God. So that's what this message is about, trying to wake these people up. You broke the covenant. Let's get this back together. Let's bring that marriage covenant back together. So verse 29, wherefore will ye plead with me? Ye all have transgressed against me, saith the Lord. So this is, why are you quarreling or contending with me, basically? So another translation on plead could be argue your case. Why are you trying to argue your case with me? You're the one that transgressed. I'm not the one to blame, basically. Verse 30, in vain have I smitten your children. They received no correction. So I'm going to pause for a second there. I tried to correct you, but you wouldn't heed my words or prophets. Even judgments of the past, such as the fall of the northern kingdom and the siege of Judah by Assyria, were not enough to bring people to repentance. I have smitten descendants, your ancestors, and you haven't learned the lessons from them, basically. Your own sword hath devoured your prophets like a destroying lion. So this is interesting. So when they talk about receiving no correction as well, when a king sowed up in a lesser province and punished them for breaking the rules, the people usually would fall in line. But Israel has not fallen in line after being rebuked by God. They're still breaking the rules. So even after, again, Assyria came down, took the northern kingdom, they didn't go turn to God. Assyria hit them again. Even Babylon is coming down. They still haven't turned to God. So God's like, I've tried to warn you guys. I've tried to let you know there's consequences here. But you haven't repented. You haven't changed. Now the interesting part here on sword, your own sword hath devoured your prophets. So the picture of a sword devouring is a well-known one. A quaint but gruesome expression is to smite to the mouth of the sword. Swords discovered in excavations often have an animal's head at the top of the blade being the tongue of the beast. So you can think of this idea of a lion's mouth, and out of the mouth is the blade of the sword, so as if the sword was the words of the lion, kind of an idea. And so they have killed with their own swords or their own words and thoughts the prophets. So now here we get, this is getting to that number 5 part of that, those letters of saying, this is what you're guilty of. You've got to solve this. So verse 31, verse 31, so yeah, I looked at the wrong one, sorry. O generation, see ye the word of the Lord. Have I been a wilderness unto Israel? Meaning, have I been inhospitable to you? Thinking back to the time when God took care of Israel as they wandered in the wilderness. When he says that, have I been a wilderness to you? No, I've helped you through the wilderness. I wasn't a wilderness to you. A land of darkness, wherefore say my people, we are lords, we will come no more unto thee. So they've made themselves experts in their own right. They are the religious experts more than God. They don't need to follow God because they have the science and the technology and improvements to do it themselves. That hopefully kind of sounds familiar and resonates a little bit with you as well in our day and age. We have that same problem. Where in this world, in today's modern world, do you see some of these similarities with ancient Judah? I look forward to hearing your ideas in the comments of what do you think about this when you read these ideas of Jeremiah and what's happening. What does this conjure up in your mind, and what can we, what is it analogous to our day and age that would say, yeah, we're kind of turning out the same way Judah is, basically. Those will be fun comments to read. So verse 32, can a maid, this is some good questions here. Can a maid forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. So when we look at 32, unlike the bride who adorns herself with chastity and faithfulness to her husband, this bride of Judah was found with soiled skirts, which were so obvious that a search was not required to find them. Israel had become so skilled in doing evil that she could teach even the experienced harlots of idolatry. In fact, we're going to see this in subsequent verses, in the next verse. In fact, this is really interesting to think about this idea in verse 32 of a bride forgetting her attire, forgetting what it was like to be a bride and have her wedding day. So do you remember how amazing our wedding day was? How can you forget this? But yet you did, Israel. You forgot the covenant. You forgot the promise. You forgot the good times we had. And that's the problem. So the seeming impossible had happened. In a vivid figure, Jeremiah observes that it is altogether unlikely that a young bride should forget her jewelry, or more particularly the sash or girdle which proclaimed her status as a married woman. Yet Israel had forgotten precisely those things which marked her out as Yahweh's covenant people, notably the covenant itself, which involved her in a total unshared loyalty to Yahweh. The heinousness of forgetting all that he had done for his people is a theme to which the prophets and writers of Israel returned again and again. It was reprehensible to forget Yahweh's past favors and divine calling. Israel was called upon to remember who Yahweh was and who they were. One important purpose of Israel's rituals was to keep fresh in the memory of the people the saving activity of Yahweh in their past history. Yet there was something more important than ritual observances, for these could be performed externally, without any deep inward commitment. Indeed, it was possible to carry out these rituals while being involved also in the worship of Baal. Nor was it that Israel lapsed occasionally. She forgot Yahweh days without number. That was from Thompson. So this wasn't just, oh, I had a one-night fling, I goofed, I'm sorry. This was Israel being gone for a long time. If you think of the idea of the prodigal son, is this same analogy. So if you look at the idea of the prodigal son and look at this idea of a bride who has left her husband and is going away and stepped out on her husband and being free with lots of lovers and other things and then wants to come back eventually, these metaphors are basically the same. They come together, which is really cool. This is a symbol of the challenges even we face in our life of being involved with the world. Sometimes we get deceived by the world and go away from God, and then we need to find our way back. And there is always a way back. God will gather those who sincerely want to follow him. And that's wonderful to understand. In fact, verse 32, verse 33, sorry. Why trimmest thou thy way to seek love? So let's pause for just a second on that one. Basically, why are you making yourself more appealing and available? Israel had planned and prepared themselves to go after other gods. It was on purpose and not haphazard. I mean, think about this. And ladies, this could be an interesting thought for you to comment on. Think about that idea. Why trimmest thou thy way to seek love? Why do you spend so much time preparing, getting dressed up, putting makeup on, getting cleaned up to look really amazing if there's no purpose behind it? I mean, that's a good question to ask. If you're not going out, if you don't get dressed up to just go, oh, I think I'm just going to dress up and casually see what I can find. No, you're getting dressed up for a purpose of finding a man that's attracted to you. So that's what's happening here. Is this isn't just Israel being casual, like, oh yeah, this guy came up to me and says, hey, you're beautiful, I want to marry you. Oh, okay, I'll go off with you too. It wasn't a haphazard thing. Israel planned and prepared for this to happen. They wanted to meet other people. So continuing on, verse 33, therefore hast thou also taught the wicked ones thy ways. That's what we talked about in 31, verse 31, that Israel was so wicked, they taught the wicked to be more wicked, basically. This isn't Israel being a harlot. This is Israel being so much of a harlot that the other harlots are taking notes from Israel. That's what's happening here, basically. How bad do you have to be that the other wicked people are taking notes from you of how to be more wicked? That's not a good indication of what's going on with Judah. This is why they faced the consequences they did. This is the problem. So a good lesson for us: keep those commandments, follow God. You don't have those negative consequences. Basically, it's really important. Now, verse 34, also in thy skirts is found the blood of the souls of the poor innocents. Okay, I have not found it by secret search, but upon all these. Now, what's interesting is the Revised Standard Version translates this as, instead of poor innocents, guiltless poor. So not only has Israel committed idolatry, basically, but they have been murdering people who were innocent. This means that Judah had a law structure that allowed innocent people to be killed. You could be found for a crime and killed without just, they didn't even have to prove it. There was no proof. In today's society, we like to think that the idea of if you're accused of a crime but it cannot be proven, then you are let free. That used to be the thing. It's kind of not going that way anymore, unfortunately. You used to be innocent till proven guilty. It was the burden of the prosecutors, the accusers, to prove you were guilty. You don't have to prove your own guilt. That's how the law typically has been working in America. That's been changing, unfortunately, which is really bad. But this is the problem: is they are blatantly doing things. So in ancient Israel, in ancient Judah, if you didn't like a person, you found a way to trump up a charge against him, you could get him executed and take their stuff. Just move them out of the way, because the law allowed this to happen. So this is the problem. The wealthy stay wealthy, the powerful stay powerful, and they change the laws to keep themselves there. And that is at the expense of the poor, of the little people, basically. They should be looking out for these people and helping them, but they've turned the laws against them, basically. Now here's what's interesting: is that it talks about, I have not found it by secret search, but upon all these. God didn't have to go look to find it. It's there. It's the blood is on their clothing. They didn't even try to hide the fact that they had done these heinous things. It was so normalized to them. They were just used to it. So verse 35, continuing on, yet thou sayest, because I am innocent, surely his anger shall turn from me. So even though they're blatantly guilty, they have the blood stains on their clothes, they're still trying to claim, I'm the innocent one. God will help us and bless us, basically. So make yourself look more appealing and available. Israel had planned, oh, sorry, that was wrong. I just read that one. Excuse me. In verse 35, the people believed they were innocent since they were just following the laws of the land. They're innocent. It's just the laws. It's the laws that are wrong. They think they're good people. And this is fascinating to think about. If you look at the story in the beginning of the Book of Mormon with Laman and Lemuel, they thought that the people at Jerusalem were righteous people. They were observing the laws. They were keeping the commandments. They were doing the ordinances and worshiping. What Laman and Lemuel did not mention in their argument of why they should go back was that what those laws were and what those ordinances were wrong. There was a fundamental wrong problem. They weren't the ones God said. They had been changed over time and normalized. And that's what Laman and Lemuel were talking about. This is the same justification, basically, that they gave. So in the end, in the second half of verse 35, behold, I will plead with thee because thou sayest, I have not sinned. Now the verb here, missed the mark or to err from the path of right of duty. That's what I have not sinned means. The covenant was the path. They have not followed it, basically. So he says in verse 36, why gaddest thou about so much to change thy way? Thou also shalt be ashamed of Egypt as thou wast ashamed of Assyria. So Assyrian power waned and Babylonian power grew. As that transition happened, Judah was worried about conquest again and hoped Assyria would win. But that was not happening. Israel then turned to Egypt for help, but that will not work out either. So this is this idea in verse 36, basically. Now, verse 37, yea, thou shalt go forth from him, and thine hands upon thine head. So if they're going like this, that's a surrender. Also a sign of grief, basically. For the Lord hath rejected thy confidences, and thou shalt not prosper in them. So basically, doing things your way will not work out. The best way to go is to follow the covenant path to God. Just keep the commandments. Do what God has asked of you. That's what you should do. Not follow more human or logical ways of doing things. Follow what God is telling you. Repent. Make the inner changes. That will help you avoid these consequences of sins and problems, basically. So a good lesson for us to learn from Judah here in the book of Jeremiah. So I know that was a really long video. Hopefully you made it through. I'm so grateful of any of you who are watching this and seeing the end of this video. Thank you so much. Let's jump over to the next chapter as we continue to move forward.